your book today. So I'm not sure with regard to the questions, if you want to kind of lead with what your book says, and then Henrie and I can kind of, on the questions, like on the first one, can conflict be predicted? And then how your book responded to that, and then Henrie and I can add to it, if that makes sense.
Here's the good news. Henry's extremely familiar with it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he helped me whittle away at this, and also crack some of the stones with me on this, the initial kind of stuff. And Henry was quite an inspiration, which I don't know if you mentioned that to you or not, but he's definitely a great sounding board. I think you know that as your friends, but one of my favorite people for sure. And,
oh, thank you.
And has a great mind to kind of think through these ideas. So he kind of helped craft that part of it. But I stand on the shoulders of giants. I just do, just like most people that produce any type of art or involved in any creative activity. You stand on the shoulders of people like, Henry, and of course, I know how a little bit about your background too. So, this is about the third or fourth book that I have written. It's the second one that has been published with a major publisher, and then I self-published a few other books. And I've written a bunch of articles for Security Magazine, spoken at As Is conferences. I've spoken at the IAHSS conferences, which, you're not familiar, that's the hospital healthcare side of the security business. So I've done a lot of that. And so I kind of took all that stuff over the 40 years I've been around this business, and kind of just, I think this is kind of the highlight of kind of putting everything in some order that I think, and that's the challenge with being creative. You have all these ideas, and what order and what starts first, what's second, and where to begin with, what's kind of the main thesis and what you're jumping off from. So for me, just having clients in healthcare and campus safety and training security officers in dealing with a lot of these violent incidences through my own company, because we also have a PPO and we hire uniform security officers and post security officers. And so through my experience with my own security personnel, through my experience with hiring security personnel, and through my experience with dealing with my client's security personnel over the 20, 30 years, these are some of the ideas that I think are important to share. And in regards to violence, we all know violence is it's not stopping anytime soon. So organizations have an ethical, moral, legal responsibility to protect not only their main asset, which is their consumers, but to protect their employees and even the security personnel, because in some cases they forget that part, but the security personnel also need protecting. So that's a little bit about kind of where I came from to get to this point, to produce this book last year. So that's a little bit of intro.
Very cool. Thanks.
Andy, I sent to you a list of questions that were based off the book. You should have gotten in your email.
I don't see them.
Oh, okay. Well,
doesn't matter.
I have them. So
you're going to ask them, and
I will ask them and kind of guide the conversation in that way.
Maybe it's better. I don't see it.
The main themes of the book is how to deal with conflict. And as you mentioned, it's a theme across all of your writings and all of your books. So my first question that I gleaned from the book is a very basic question. Can conflict be predicted? And it's a question that is really important for private businesses, and they can't afford the disruption of conflict. And so I want to pose the question of, can conflict be predicted? And I'll throw it out to you two gentlemen.
I think anytime anybody writes about conflict, we're going to say it's inevitable and unpredictable. I mean, those are just two things about it, right? Because it's about humans and how humans interact, and you don't need to really think too far outside of your own, relationships to know that every relationship has some form of interpersonal conflict. So it's kind of a simple idea that if we now get other people together, even within the context of an organization, yeah, it's going to be conflict. So if the question is it predictable? I would say in one sense, it will always occur, but in regards to the unpredictability or the frequency or occasions of it, and then how the people respond to it, I think that's kind of the bigger question, because yes, it occurs. Is it predictable in this general sense? Yes, it will happen. Is it predictable on the individual level? In other words, we make contact with an individual, and can we know within a reasonable amount of time as we interact with them, will that escalate? And I'm getting much better at saying yes to that, because I've spent a lot of time, especially lately. In fact, I was just writing something that probably plays into this, that a lot of my clients go through something called TAC-COM. I know Al is familiar with this. A lot of these catalysts teach it. And then they have different systems, like verbal judo and some of them, right? So I started to reframe that. It's not really tactical communication, it's relational communication. So I play with acronyms, and I said RELCOM. So I said to one of my clients, have you guys been trained in RELCOM? And of course, they're like, what the hell are you talking about? And I said, well, because I know you were trained in tactical communication and you were trained in verbal judo, but it's relational communication. So the focus is on the relationship. And so I've kind of really got to that. I'm really kind of digging deep to kind of find out kind of where this all starts. So your first question is really kind of a springboard to what the last week or two I've been working on some new concepts, that it's about relationship building. And even if in a workplace context, we get called to a customer service complaint, and now we're the third party or the third person involved, we need to establish a relationship with those individuals, and particularly the person who's maybe passive aggressive or maybe uncooperative. And that's a newer idea even for me in my writings and my thinking. So I'm kind of digging down deep into that. So I have some tentative ideas, but they're just tentative. But I think it's about the relationship, which is different than the communication, right? So when you think about human communication, my background discipline is human communication. I have a master's degree, done some postgraduate work in communication, human communication. But then I started thinking about it's really about relationships. So sorry, that's a long answer.
So to summarize your answer, you're saying that yes, conflict is in a sense inevitable. As long as you have two human beings or more, you're going to have some level of conflict, and that the conflict is largely predicated on relationships, and that there may be some indicators that would give you an indication that you're going to have more conflict rather than less based on your interaction.
Yes.
But the mitigating factor may in fact be relationships and how that is developing on the fly in a security conflict concept.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary, Henry, because if you think about it, they are relationships. Even if they're 5 seconds, 15 seconds, 3-minute interactions, they're still relationships, which means if two people are going to get together and negotiate a positive outcome, or at least negotiate and settle on something that is at least nonviolent, let's put it that way, because in some cases it may be, we've had enough of you, leave. So it's a relationship now that's terminated, right? But prior to that point of termination, it is a relationship. And then in the more legal civil sense, you both know, there's never a sense where you have no relationship with anybody who actually shows up at your door, so to speak, or on your property. You have a legal fiduciary responsibility to create a safe environment, even as they're leaving. And even if they're, even if they're involved in criminal activity, there's still some case law that says you still have to provide a minimal level of safety for them. So we even have to, work that into the equation.
Al, what's your take on that question of conflict and predictability?
No, I actually like Andrew's response. As opposed to verbal judo or tactical communication, it is trying to build that, relationship immediately. I know, coming from the world of law enforcement, you're initially taught, okay, you show up, command presence, that first couple of seconds where folks are going to kind of size you up and you're sizing them up. Well, in that instance, you happen to be wearing usually a uniform, a badge, very formal, very official, where you may, just by showing up that way, you have an advantage. But in what I think Andrew is mentioning, you probably don't have that type of an advantage. So it really is about showing up, looking confident, feeling confident, and being able to, whether it's hello, hi, can I help you, or however you do that, where you can kind of size up a situation and be able to determine, okay, is this going to be a good situation or not a good situation? So I like your take on that, Andrew.
No, I think Henry probably has a question there since it's just like Karnak.
Yeah, you do. I do. I want to piggyback off of what Al just said. In your book, Andy, you talk a bit about developing rapport in the first moments of any interaction with someone. And you stress on the importance of developing that rapport. And Al just mentioned that. And during that rapport building, I think there is naturally a sizing up or an assessment of the interaction. Who am I dealing with? What's this guy's authority? How is he coming at me in terms of respect, or what words is he using? And I'm wondering, during that rapport building, during that size up period, do you believe that there are indicators that can be gleaned from the interaction that would indicate to a trained person whether this is going to go farther down the road of conflict, or can it diverge into an area of peaceful negotiation?
Very good question. And this is how I look at that. Once we choose to interact with another person, there's the reciprocal nature of the interaction, the relationship, right? Like you said, we're sizing them up, they're sizing us up. This is a general point, right? A more particular point is that because we're in a position of authority, we've either been called to this potential conflict or we've observed it. We start at a different point because obviously it's not oftentimes the start of it. There's a little bit of tension built in already. So, and we know it. And so as we approach that interaction, that relationship, we take that into account. So this is what happens. I'm, quote, sizing up the individual, and I'm looking to gain information that will then help me to decide what verbal or physical path I take. This kind of makes sense. So I need information, right? So where do we get information from when we're interacting with another human? I'll give you a couple of suggestions. The face is probably the big area where if I'm looking for the most information, right? If I had to just, there's going to be, I think, 3 or 4 areas I'll mention, but I think the face, and then you have the body, obviously. You have the words that the people say. And so if I'm sizing someone up, I'm looking at their face. What does the face tell me? I'm looking at their body, basically from the neck down, approximately. What does their body tell me? And then what do the words tell me? So let's just break it down into those three, I'm going to say, sources of information. So when I interact with someone, they call me, there's some conflict, I get there, I'm going to look at their face, look at their body, and listen to their words, right? So there's 3 main sources of information. And if I'm smart, I'm going to use every bit of information I gain from those sources to be able to then formulate my verbal plan and or my tactical physical plan. Again, you've heard this before, I'm not saying anything probably fresh, but I will say this. I've been studying a lot more about the face. And this is what the studies show about the face. The face tells us the emotion. The face communicates the emotion. So I'm always looking to determine what type of emotional stability the person is involved in when I'm interacting with them. So if their emotions are stable, they're probably going to be more rational, more cooperative, maybe my authority, they'll respect my authority. But as people become emotionally stable, then what happens next? Their body, again, we just said below the shoulders and that body, is going to then demonstrate what the emotion shows. So let's just say the face shows anger, the body will then do something, clench fists, take a pose, whatever. And so, and then again, we have the words, but the words are the least valuable because the face is hard to manipulate, and the body, again, because it's nonverbal, is hard to manipulate. And so I'm hearing what they're saying, but I'm really looking at their face and their body. Now here's, and Al's going to appreciate this. Here's the challenge with law enforcement training, because we're so used to knowing that hands and feet kill. Unfortunately, and I believe this is at times, again, my opinion, I don't think it's been studied, police officers may spend an inordinate amount of time looking at the feet, looking at the hands, because we know hands and feet kill, and they miss the face and what the face is expressing in the emotion. Because if the face is showing anger, yes, the body will show it. But if the face is showing I'm afraid or fear, you may find the same body reactions, but they're not really attack, they're fear. And so, again, I'm sorry I'm going this complex, but because this is, again, some newer stuff I've been looking at. There's a bunch of people that study face and what the face means, micro expressions and those things. And then even Henrie and I explored this earlier, because we're wearing masks, we miss a lot of micro expressions and we miss a lot of expressions, and that's where we get the emotion. So if someone is anxious or afraid or sad and their face is covered up, how are we going to know it? So it makes it difficult for us to formulate our verbal and tactical plan once we interact with someone.
Okay, Al.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about what you were saying with reading the face, because I'm thinking COVID-19 now, and everybody is literally wearing a mask, and
Yes.
where just last year, walking into a place with a mask, you might have been told, hey, you need to remove that or something, and now it just makes it a much more difficult proposition when responding to some type of a issue and not being able to actually read. You're now only looking at the eyes, basically the forehead, and it makes it a lot more difficult, because you're right, the training is watch the hands, because they're the ones that are going to do the damage to you. But when you take away the face, and you may not even be paying attention to what they're saying, because the nonverbal clues are the ones you are trained to key in on. And so now without the face, it makes it more difficult, because now you're trying to judge and you have to listen to what they're saying, but you still have lost this, which to me could become a much larger problem.
Yeah.
Andy, let me give you a follow-up question on that. And I want to get into the weeds here a little bit. I agree with you that the face is what we want to study. What are some of the specifics that I would look for that would tell me this is going down a road of escalation in terms of conflict, maybe towards violence? Are there any specific twitches or facial expressions that I'm looking for that is going to tell me this is going the wrong way fast?
Well, some very basic ones. I mean, there's some really good material, and I don't have the book in front of me, the text, or even the author. As I was speaking, I was trying to recall the author's name. And they actually show slides to people, and they teach them that based upon furrows in the brow, eyebrow movements, even just movements in the very small muscles in the face, that you can get so good at reading them that you could pick up the 5 or 6, 7 major emotions: sadness, anger, disgust, surprise, happiness, fear. And those are the main ones. And again, from our perspective, the anger and the fear ones are ones I would argue we should master. Because if we can master these facial cues that will tell us the difference between afraid and angry, let's face it, those are the two emotions that then drive the body to then pose up, clench up, get into a fighting stance, or grab us or fight. I mean, those are the two big ones, right? So what's the difference between a fear emotion and an anger emotion? There's some subtleties there, but they're both emotions that we need to be cautious of, because once they're expressed physically, then there's a risk for us as the individual attempting to resolve the interaction. So regarding the specific ones, it's the ones that we're kind of all familiar with. I mean, it could just be a head tilt, it could be a roll of an eye, but usually like a smile or a neutral or a frown, those are things we can pick up pretty easily. If someone smiles, they're generally probably not angry or fearful. And so those are the things that we've done since we were hatched, right? As we grow up, we get those. And so I think in most cases, it's just a matter of changing your focus from like 70% on the body and just kind of moving it up and giving it a little more balance with face body as I'm conducting that analysis. And it's happening like that. I am going to produce a video, Henrie and Al, that's going to go over some of the particular facial expressions, because I want to show the slides. Because just to talk about it is hard, because a lot of times they're micro expressions. But both of you have mentioned, and Henrie and I have talked about this for months, about once you cover up the face area, you lose information, and we need information to develop and maintain relationships. And so if you take away that information, trying to maintain or even initiate or develop a relationship, it's harder and harder and harder. You have to rely more and more and more on the words, right? And less on the nonverbals. And as in police work, and Al knows this is part of the challenge. Most police officers are in a hurry. There's just a sense that if I get called to a conflict or something happening, there's a clock ticking that we've got to get this done now and move on. And I don't mean it as a disrespect to anybody. My son's a deputy. My whole family's retired or currently a police officer. It's just that in the police world, there is a clock always ticking. So when I go to interact with someone, the clock's ticking. So I'm just saying somehow we have to slow that down, not to zero, but we just have to focus a little more on the face. What is the emotion being expressed by the face, not so much by the words, because the emotion expressed by the face will then be demonstrated by the body. So if my face is angry, my body will show anger. If my face shows sadness, you'll see that in my body. And so we have to be able to see that. So I'm not trying to avoid the question. It's just that the things that we've grown up knowing about what face means and understanding, and we know this, the face and the body don't often lie. It's the words that lie. And we've all been around people who they're never going to tell us the truth. In law enforcement context, when you make contact with somebody, you assume they're lying. And in most cases, that doesn't hamper the relationship now to the extreme. It could, but in the short-term officer safety, it probably doesn't, because we're going to assume, based upon the context of the call, they're probably not going to be honest with me. Even good people may have this thing that say, I don't talk to the police, so anything I say, I'm just not going to be honest or truthful. So in that context, we get it. But put it in the context of organizational safety and professional security officers, I probably don't assume the person I'm making contact with is not being honest. On a scale, if I know they're in crisis, obviously, I don't know why, but they may not be trying to get by me, because I'm not trying to arrest them and take their freedom away. I'm just here to kind of figure out what the problem is. And if I'm a problem solver, they're more likely to be honest with me. But if they have a sense that I'm going to take their freedom away, like in law enforcement, it would make sense that they may not want to be completely honest.
Okay, let me pivot this question towards Al. Al, you mentioned that in the last 9, 10, 11 months, we've all been wearing masks because of COVID-19. Do you feel that the fact that most people are now wearing masks has contributed to the large number of conflicts we've seen in retail establishment, restaurants, and others? Do you feel it's a communication thing because they can't read the expression? Or do you feel it's just part of the times and the increased tension because of COVID-19?
I actually believe it's multiple pieces of what you just mentioned. I think the frustration of not being able to go out and do the things that we did a year ago, year and a half ago, and being able to just express ourselves. I also think, and I really don't like saying it this way, especially about a mask, but because it's been on the so much, kind of politicizing the use of a mask. And so I've seen actual conflicts in stores where folks are being asked, hey, can you please wear a mask? Because we're trying to, it protects us as much as it protects you. And just flat out knows, no, I'm not going to wear a mask. I don't have to wear a mask. I received the shot, so therefore I don't need this. And you can see the employees are usually kind of backing off, and they'll get a supervisor or a manager, and then that issue is just continues to get heightened until either, well, we're going to call the police, because it gets into an actual, loud voices, arguing just because somebody does not want to wear one. And it's really an interesting phenomenon.
Andy, your thoughts?
Well, I think Al nailed it, summarized it well. If I was giving advice to a retailer, I mean, that may be a different kind of question, but yeah, it's the retailer has the authority to kind of decide how that works out. The challenge that I have, and Henry and I have talked about this, I've had 2 or 3 or 4 instances where the interaction wasn't really pleasant with putting the mask on. And so Henry and I have talked about this before. And so on one hand, we do want, from the retailer's perspective, if they have policies about mask wearing, then the training has to occur at the lowest level of the clerk who probably has most contact with the people who may not be cooperating. And so the challenge here is, how do you confront an individual who either forgets, given the benefit of the doubt, or just decides they don't want to? How do you confront them and not lose them as a consumer? Because every day as a retailer, it gets harder and harder and harder to keep customers coming into the door. Everyone's pressing the button to get stuff delivered. So what percentage of those people that come in that don't want to wear a mask or forgot the mask, or whatever, how many of those people do you want to lose? And then how many of those people you think are going to create some greater harm or risk if they're not masked, right? I'll give you an example. At Lowe's, I have a friend who's a manager. He says their policy from the beginning was to put the signs up that this is what we would like, it's required, the CDC, all this stuff. But they were instructed by their senior management, do not confront anyone without a mask. Don't say anything to them. And further, they said, when customers then come to them and say, hey, manager, look at them, they also have a policy that says to that person, don't confront them. That's our policy. Now, Lowe's, that's still their policy as far as I know. I don't hear a lot of problem with Lowe's. It may be a unique context because of it, but compare that with Costco. You can't get past that person checking at the door. It cannot. And if you do get past that initial check, they'll call managers and they'll swoop in. I've seen it happen. And so that's their way of dealing with it. But retailers, they need people to come in the door to spend their money. So this is the challenge. I mean, what Al said is true, that sometimes it leads to physical altercations on the extreme. I'm always worried about safety first, but I'm not, as an entrepreneur, I can't discount, forget you. If you don't want to wear a mask, or you think it's dumb or stupid or politically incorrect, or you think, fine, get lost, get out of here. I don't subscribe to that either. So that's why it's a hard thing. I'm an entrepreneur and I want that customer. And so I need to find a way, a delicate way to convince them this is in their best interest, and not just in my best interest, because there's a lot of things that organizations ask us to do that may be totally irrational and maybe has nothing to do with my best interest. And so how do you communicate that in a way that they will either accept it, even begrudgingly, and still come back? Because remember, you gotta get them to come back. Because if they put the mask on and never come back and go and tell 5 of their other anti-mask buddies, forget them, you don't want that either. So this is a delicate thing. And I think Al summarized it well. And I would just say, if I was going to train the staff, it has to be the lowest level up. And as Al mentioned, anyone that does any confrontation needs to be a manager because they have some authority. The clerk, you tell the clerk, fly a kite and keep stepping. But the manager comes in, they may have the authority to say, look, if you don't leave, I have to call the police and you can trespass. So that's my summary of kind of how we have to deal with it as an entrepreneur and as a public safety health issue.
So what I hear you saying, in a sense, is that organizations, private business, kind of have a different focus than the public as a whole. And conflict management is probably best dealt with differently in a private business than it would be on a public street with law enforcement. You just kind of relate a story about Lowe's that talked about how they're dealing with the mask. They're not taking the hardline approach and calling the police on you. They are kind of doing a risk management concept that says, okay, we're going to balance this with our need to continue to do business. So my question to you is, do you agree with me that private business have different objectives than the public as a whole in terms of safety?
Well, if the question is, how does law enforcement deal with uncooperative individuals, in this case, say mask wearers, and how would a private business deal with uncooperative people, say in the mask area? Sure. I mean, there's different levels of authority. So let's just say, again, this is kind of absurd, but I've seen videos where police officers are confronting people who are not masked, right? They may have the legal authority to, if they resist, grab a hold of them, to control them, maybe to arrest them. I don't know that part of it. But in a private business, arresting somebody in a private business is not good for business. It's just not. Arresting anybody in a private business, it impacts your business. When I was younger, and maybe some of you did this, I used to get shoplifters for alpha beta. I mean, I did that, run out, chase them, drag them back into the store and stuff. And I can't tell you how many times the manager of the store particularly was like, you know what, people saw you dragging the person in the fight, and it creates a real kind of a hostile, negative environment if you want to go have a pleasant experience where you're conducting some type of consumption. So yes, out in the public, if a police officer was to grab all that person, handcuff them, if it was a simple use of force, put them on the ground, handcuff them, take them away, probably nobody would be that. I mean, it probably wouldn't create a havoc. I'm going to say most communities, especially if it's a non-racial kind of interaction. So yes, they have different kinds of authority and a different mission. The mission of a private business is to maximize their profit. And so being that is their goal, they have to be able to be very quick on their feet to make adjustments, policy-wise adjustments and exceptions. In law enforcement, being consistent with applying the law is almost an imperative. And being inconsistent may go against their own mission and ethics.
I'll question for you. And just as Andy said, business have different objectives than the public at large, and wanting to continue the relationship with their customers. An emerging issue that we see in the nation in general is this issue of insider threats. And we talked about there being indicators of conflict on a personal level. Do you believe that there are indicators with this concept of insider threats? That is, the conflict comes from the employee or a customer who is part of that organizational community.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with that. Just a recent, after 9/11, it was terrorism that's coming from outside into the United States. And then you fast forward to 20 years to the Capitol. That's not that same terrorist, so to speak, that has now come and gone into the Capitol. But making it even simpler when we're talking about businesses, your issues related to an employee that maybe was passed over for a promotion, an employee that may have felt slighted. These things can build up over time and progress to the point where they've now been terminated potentially. They go home, they retrieve a weapon, come back and take it out on whoever they felt was responsible for that. And so when you look at the totality, those are the folks as well that you really have to be careful with, because the potential for something to happen, especially in today's day and age, is far greater than I believe it had been, years past. That's kind
Now,
of what
wouldn't it be nice, wouldn't it be nice that for HR personnel that are involved in these terminations to also have some of this training, again, getting back to the face and those kind of things, to understand that, yeah, the person who's losing their job, no one's going to demonstrate happiness, but to be able to kind of determine, my exit interview, this is what I observed, the nonverbal behavior, the physical behavior, this is what I noticed, besides what the person said. The person could be, in a sense, say nothing other than, yeah, right, you're firing me, that's great. But the rest of their face could communicate, I'm angry, my body's angry, and wouldn't that be something that we want to kind of communicate maybe to the security department, loss prevention department? But this is also part of the training that needs to take place for people who are on that front line, so that they're gathering, again, this is, we'll call it intel, to use more of a police term. They're gathering intelligence about potential human relationships gone wrong, and to give us, help us to say, these are potential problems based upon my assessment of this information I gathered from the individual. I know that what I just said is not, earth shattering, but that's important too.
No, I completely agree with you, Andy. I think that was a real good kind of summary of what needs to happen, both at the HR level, the organizational level, maybe at the security level. I think that intel needs to be gathered, and I think it needs to be communicated to people who can act on it. I think that that's true for the termination scenario. And I also think that it's probably true on the hiring side of the table, where we're looking at indicators or looking for indicators of potential problems before we bring them into the community. We indicated at the top of the hour that there were certain things that we could look for that would tell us that there's going to be conflict in the future. And I believe that those indicators probably hold true for hiring. Al, let me turn this over to you. Are there things that intelligence that can be gathered on the hiring side where it could tell us, hey, we might have a conflict with this person based on our understanding of the organization and who we think you are?
Well, it would depend on what organization these folks are going to go work. Privately, there's many different things that you can do, and one of them is social media. What's been going on in their life, so that you could potentially see, oh wow, they're doing these, holding an AK-47, and with folks that probably aren't the most law-abiding. I mean, we'll say it that way. And so you have avenues where you can actually go. Previous employers, many times, however, we've come across issues where a previous employer is just so or a current employer, let's say, is just so happy that this person may move on. They're going to give them the most glowing recommendation ever. And all of a sudden, now you just bought a problem because these folks are so happy to get rid of that problem. And so there are many things, again, that you just have to balance out. Maybe instead of speaking to just one person at the firm, maybe you want to say, okay, is there someone else I could speak to? So that way you're able to get a more holistic, rounded look at somebody.
Andy, piggybacking on that, I know that for key positions, there's assessment tools that are done and as part of the hiring process. Understanding that in most employment, there's going to be some level of conflict that they need to negotiate. Do you believe that there is a process where we can put you in a scenario and see how you react to the conflict? Do you exacerbate the problem or do you resolve the problem?
No, I think in my book, I kind of spend probably a lot of time in this area because oftentimes people like they talk about the job requires like say 5 or 6 of these things that you have to be good at. And then what happens is you come to the interview and they say, "Are you good at these 5 things?" And you say, "Yes, I am." And they, okay, you're good at those things, but there's not a way to quantify that competency. So they say, here's these 5 things, must be good at this, this, that, or whatever. But no one ever, there's no test. You just say it. So I call it qualified by affirmation, which is kind of the way I use that terminology, qualified by affirmation. You ask me, I say yes. And of course, an applicant's going to say yes to anything because they want the job. So I think it just makes sense that as many of those minimum requirements, whatever those 5, 6, 7 things are, I think you should be able to, quote, demonstrate them during an interview. And a scenario role play is beautiful. And I don't mean the one where someone reads off a piece of paper and they say, "Let me tell you a story about a conflict," and they say to you, "And how would you handle that?" And then you very calmly walk into the whole thing. No, create some type of conflict in that room that they can now do. Now we have videos we can do. I prefer live actors, but that could be an expense, but at least use the video simulation to at least try to create some type of emotion that they're going to have to demonstrate that they can process. And it doesn't have to be a high level emotion. Henrie knows this. We've done this because I've used video simulation for over 10 years. And we've done this, I mean, just very low level of a negative interaction. Maybe the person has an interaction where they say screw you or F you or something, just minor type of responses. And I've seen applicants freeze up. They'll stop and they'll look at me. They're like, "What do I do?" And so we've seen that just with some simple things. And so imagine as an applicant for these professional security officer positions, when they ask you, how are you at resolving conflict? And you're like, "I'm fantastic. I do it well, do all the time." I say, "Good, hold on. Face the screen. We're going to provide a scenario for you. Just act it out and let us observe." Could you imagine just that one thing? Now, I'm not going to stop there, Al, because I want to also use some force videos too, where they may have to pull out their firearm, their taser, baton, just something, again, very, very basic. So, sorry, Henrie, you got me worked up there.
No, I see that you're passionate about it, and it's good. You mentioned that, to have live actors would cost an organization more than they're willing to spend. So let me kind of turn that question on its head and ask, what does an organization pay for conflict handled inappropriately? Is there a cost that discourages inappropriate response to conflict, or is it just something that happens and we have to live with it?
Well, if we talk about violence particularly, because conflict, let's face it, 90% of interpersonal conflict, it doesn't escalate beyond just maybe some verbal abuse. It just doesn't. So there's a very small percentage of that passive aggressive behavior that is very typical, especially in some service or environment, that as that starts to escalate, oftentimes that is the person gives up rather quickly, or low levels of force are used and it's done. But if we talk about the violence part of it, I definitely think you're on something, because even if you have maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, say, violent incidences in an entire year, wouldn't that have been nice to at least say, and here's what I'd love to say, I've trained your personnel, and there's a high likelihood that they didn't exacerbate or create or enable that behavior. Wouldn't that be nice to say? Because I can't tell you how many times my clients will tell me after a force incident that their own security people are the ones that instigated, enabled it, or exacerbated it. So I know for my clients, they would love to be able to say, look, this was just a very unstable person, and no matter what training we had, this was going to happen, or it was going to be really hard for us to keep it from happening. And we had to rely on outside resources like the police or some higher level of tactics to deal with that. But I know my clients, and this is the first question that we talk about on a regular basis. I'm going to come in and do training, and either it was because of some incident, or we're trying to, like Henrie said, present an incident. But I would say that most of my clients will say, when my people get into it, especially when they use force, there's a good likelihood that they had something to do with either exacerbating it or enabling it. And I've heard that so many times and I usually defend the officers. And in some cases, the HR, the legal people, they have a tendency to kind of over exaggerate the influence of their security people. But I still say that there's a nugget of truth in that, in those interactions, those statements.
Okay. And in the interest of time, Al, your thoughts in the next minute or so?
No, I think this is not only an important, but will continue to be a very timely topic. What you've discussed, especially for the private businesses, is going to be much more than what certainly bringing in law enforcement to try to deal with some of these issues. Having the trained folks there to be able to de-escalate or try to make sure these issues don't occur, I think will be more important ultimately for the businesses than always trying to use, well, I'm going to call the police, because that oftentimes doesn't work.
And in fact, too costly for them in the long run because of civil litigation and other aspects.
And when we call the police, it's just an acknowledgement that the relationship is broken down. That's really all it is to summarize it. It's an acknowledgement that the relationship's broken down. And then we call the police to make the relationship whole again. I mean, it's an unrealistic expectation to put on the responding police officer. It really is. They can't make it whole. So what do? Enforce the law, which means then they take control and it's a broken relationship. But now we just remove that person. And then that has repercussions because if the police officer goes home, that person may be in the neighborhood and they continue to come back and interact in a negative fashion. It's just one of those challenges, ongoing challenges. But thank you for that input. I appreciate it.
Well, that concludes our hour at this point. I'm sure there'll be additional podcasts coming in the near future.
Good.
And I'll turn it over back to you.
Good. Well, thank you, Al. Thank you, Henry. This is basically a conversation, kind of circling, around the book. But the main thing is that the things that the three of us have discussed, these are important issues. And I know when people ask me, why do you care so much? Because sometimes I get super passionate. The organizations aren't really hiring and placing these uniformed security officers in a place to protect their main asset, which is their, you could say it's their employee legally and also their consumer. So it's both. But then here's the other thing, protecting themselves. And I feel for the security officer who's working day in and day out, long hours, by themselves often. They don't get a lot of love from sometimes the employer and sometimes a lot of disrespect from the people they interact with. And so that's kind of drives my passion to help them to be better at protecting themselves and others. And so hopefully we'll continue to have that conversation and balance what's best for the security officer, what's best for the employees, and what's best for the consumers. I mean, we have to kind of figure out a way to balance those three drivers of commerce and interest to really come up with the best solutions to solve this problem. So thank you, and let's get together soon, and we'll talk about funding. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.